So, I've reached a new level of awakening that I want to tell you about. If you're interested in something more practical, less lofty and metaphysical, then you might want to skip this episode. Otherwise, here we go. So, as you know, I've been awakening a lot and over the last few years, and especially many of my awakenings were very solipsistic. I've talked about that in the past. And I've been struggling to integrate this solipsism for years now, really. I would say that like probably my last 30 or more awakenings were revealing a deeper and deeper form of solipsism, and my mind had to struggle to make sense of it, to integrate it into ordinary life and that sort of thing. And I know that many of you who've been following along have also struggled with that and have a lot of questions about that, which I've answered here and there and I've alluded to and so forth. But there was, even though like my awakenings have become really deep and I successfully integrated a lot of the solipsism stuff and kind of gotten over it personally, but still there was something in the back of my mind that was always bugging me about that. Like I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was something there. Like I could tell that there was more to be revealed. And so I started really wondering, okay, like what could be missing? What could I be missing? Let me try to disprove my deepest awakenings as best as I can. Not for the sake of anybody else, but just for my own sake. Because as I've talked about with self-deception, self-deception is possible. Even when you're awakening, self-deception is possible in the sense that you can misinterpret your awakening, or you can come back into ordinary life and then have ideas about it that aren't quite right, that sort of thing. So I wanted to see, the next time I awoke, I wanted to see and really like push myself to try to disprove it. And this is what happened when I did that. I had one of my awakenings and it was sort of the usual solipsistic sort, very profound, of course, but by this point I've had so many of them that I'm kind of comfortable with that headspace. But I decided to go deeper. I decided to really like start from scratch, throw away every idea about awakening that I had, all the teachings and all of my own ideas and all of my past awakenings, like throw it all away, like really go back to the drawing board as close to a blank slate as possible and re-inquire completely from scratch, as it were. And of course, the inquiry is, who am I, and what is God? Like really, at rock bottom, what is it? And so I entered into a state of very profound not-knowing, where I threw away everything. And you might wonder, well, Leo, haven't you done that before? And of course, I have, to various degrees. But this time, like I was really in a sort of not knowing headspace. I went very, very deep with it because I felt like, the thing that happens is that you have your awakenings, then you start to develop ideas and theories, and you start to make sense of those awakenings. And that sort of adds like conceptual baggage on top of them. And over time, as you're doing that, you do sort of build up like a sort of you might call it a meta worldview. Like, yes, in awakening, you're transcending all beliefs, structures, and all ideology, and even all spiritual teachings. Ideally, you're transcending all of that. But even as you do that, still you come back and you still develop beliefs about it. You still have ideas about it. You still have to make sense of it to yourself somehow. You still have to talk about it. In my case, I still have to communicate it and teach it and so forth. And so that does build up a sort of like meta baggage, meta conceptual baggage. So it can be good to once in a while just completely wipe the slate clean, because that stuff can be distorting and coloring how your future awakenings unfold. And maybe it holds you back from the deepest awakenings possible. So I did that. I wiped the slate completely clean. Just a very profound sense of not knowing. And, you know, a little extra point to this is that, look, especially once you've had, you know, if you've done a lot of psychedelics, if you had a lot of awakenings, if you've done a lot of meditation, if you've done a lot of spiritual study, you can develop a sort of like spiritual arrogance in the sense that you tell yourself, well, like, I've already experienced so much. I've awoken so much and so deeply, and I've studied all this material. So like now, surely there's nothing I could possibly be missing. And that's, of course, exactly where you could fall into a trap, right? So you have to be aware of that, how that can be a trap. Hopefully you're aware of that. So anyways, you know, of course, I've always been aware of that. So in this whole experience, like I really wanted to like confront the possibility that somehow I'm fooling myself. So that's the intention I went in with. Then, so I'm in a state of profound not knowing. And then I noticed just how much everything, all insight, all understanding about reality and about self is locked behind a profound fear. Just this deep primordial fear of coming to face with truth or with reality beyond what you've previously known. And so I felt a bit of that fear. It's like, well, shit, I'm letting everything go, you know. What am I afraid of? Well, what if something comes up? What if something is revealed to me that contradicts everything that came before? So there could be that kind of fear, or just there's a very primordial fear of like, well, what if the truth is ugly and horrific and something awful will be revealed to me? You know, a lot of times we talk about beautiful truths about God and love and the liberation from suffering, you know, this kind of stuff. But then in the back of your mind, you're like, but what if reality isn't actually like that? What if you let go of all that stuff and you go like even deeper, let's say beyond all that, you question all of that. What if deep down what you find is something horrific and you're afraid of that? You're afraid of admitting you've been wrong. Like, what if you're fundamentally wrong about not just your materialistic worldview, but even your spiritual worldview? And in my case, you know, what if I'm wrong about the things that I've been teaching? That's, of course, a kind of fear that you would have as a teacher. Because when you're teaching thousands of people, you know, it's a big responsibility. Hopefully you're aware of that. And then if you're misleading all those people, and if you've been misleading them for years, that would be a very big fear that you might face as a teacher, for example. And of course, there could be many other kinds of fears that you might have. But anyways, I sort of, I recognize this fear, and but I also fully accepted it, and I was willing to just be honest and to see whatever the truth was. I was willing to look at it, regardless of the fear. And that's a key point for you here in this work, is that whatever your fears are in spiritual work, eventually you're going to have to face them. Because the truth, you're going to find that the truth and the greatest love is always found locked behind your greatest fears. This is a common theme throughout all of human mythology and the hero's journey. And I mean, the hero's journey is basically talking about the spiritual journey. And the reason most people don't go looking for the truth is because it's scary. They're afraid of what they're going to find. And in most cases, they have good reason to be afraid, because most people's lives and their minds and psyches and worldviews are constructed on foundations of sand, really no foundation at all. It's just a house of cards. And as soon as you start pulling on those cards, the whole house is going to fall apart very quickly. And so that's scary. If your career is based upon a house of cards, that's going to collapse. If your relationships or your marriage is based on a house of cards, that can collapse. If your religion or ideology or scientific worldview is based on, or your like career as a public intellectual is based upon a house of cards, which all of it is basically, that's going to fall apart. Your political ideologies, those will fall apart. So people who have built up grand houses of cards, and then they rely upon those for their survival, to feed themselves, to feed their children and their family, to take care of them, to give them sex and love and approval and status and reputation, all the goodies that the ego wants, various kinds of pleasure as well. If your house of cards is providing that to you, you're going to be very afraid of looking underneath the foundation of your house of cards because you're going to discover that it's just a house of cards. And so anyways, that was just an aside. But then anyway, so I go beyond this primordial fear. And then as much as I'm trying to disprove the solipsism, I can't disprove it. It's just, I'm in an absolute state of consciousness, and it's absolutely apparent to me that there is no other but myself. I am completely alone. And so at this point, it's just a recapitulation. It's kind of like I'm punching at a brick wall, thinking that maybe I can punch through it, but here I'm punching at it and I can't punch through it. And so this just reaffirms my past solipsism. And I focus my mind on this aspect of absolute consciousness and myself as being absolute consciousness, of the sovereignty, the absolute sovereignty of consciousness, the absolute sovereignty of God, myself as God. And at this point, I'm in a complete God mode, God consciousness. And so I'm just exploring this God consciousness and contemplating it as it's, as I'm in it. And I'm just wondering, like, in awe at the sovereignty. Now, I've talked about this sovereignty point before in the past. I especially have a video called How Authority Works, which talks about this point. Very important video that a lot of people still, I don't think, have grasped who follow my work. So go rewatch that one. But anyways, yeah, the sovereignty. See, God is absolutely sovereign. Do you understand this? What does this mean? God is absolutely sovereign. It means that because God is one, because God is alone, and God is all there is, God is consciousness, infinite consciousness, this consciousness is completely sovereign onto itself. Now, if you don't like the word God and you want to use the word universe, you could use that. Or if you want to use the word reality, you can use that. These are all synonyms. See, if you're coming at this from a more materialistic scientific perspective, you can just use the word reality and just kind of like ask yourself, if reality is infinite, if there's only one reality, reality is sovereign onto itself. You see that? There can't be something outside of reality that places limits upon or dictates or mandates to reality. Reality is sovereign. That means it's self-determining. Another way to put it is to say that whatever reality wants, however reality wants to be, it can be that way without anyone stopping it. Who would stop reality from being however way it wants? Now, this is kind of weird to hear if you're like a scientifically minded person, because you would say, well, Leo, reality doesn't want anything. So you're anthropomorphizing reality. Yeah, I get that, but you don't understand that it's not that I'm anthropomorphizing reality. It's actually you're demystifying reality. You're materializing reality. You're not seeing reality as a mind or as a consciousness. You're de-spiriting reality, and that's why to you it seems like I'm anthropomorphizing reality. But actually reality wills itself to be however it wants. It's sovereign. That's what God is. God is sovereign. If you just kind of like intuitively think about the notion of God, the concept of God, would the concept of God make any sense if God was a subject to some other power or authority outside of itself, beyond itself, second to itself? Like if you came to God and you said, hey, God, make me some vanilla ice cream, and God'd say, well, I can't. And you'd be like, well, why? You're God. You can do anything. And God would say, well, no, but there's somebody above me telling me that I can't. It's like, no, right? That doesn't make sense for the concept of God. Just intuitively, it doesn't make sense. That wouldn't be God in this case. In that case, what would be God is the thing that's above, the thing that's setting the limit on making the ice cream. That would actually be God. So if you go to God and then say, God, do something for me, and then God says, no, I can't do that. And then you say, why? And then God says, well, because the laws of physics prevent it, or because it's not possible within time and space, or within the laws of this universe. You see, that can't work either, because you can't appeal to laws or to physics or to limits of time and space or to limits of logic even. You can't appeal to these things because these things would then be God. If you're saying that God is limited by physics, that means physics is God. And then you have to skip the middleman, whoever you're calling God in this case, skip that guy and go straight to physics. Go to the real God and then ask physics. Okay, physics. Be some way for me that I want you to be. And then see if you could talk to physics and physics say, well, no, but I can't do that. Why not? Why can't you do that? And then physics will say, well, I can't do that because why? There would have to be something else beyond physics that is limiting physics. Or physics could say, well, I don't want to do that because I'm determining myself. I want to be the way that I am, right? I want to maintain the physics as it is. Now, in this case, it's not that physics can't change, it's that physics doesn't want to change because physics is self-determining, see? But in this case now, physics is sovereign. It's sovereign because it can change, but it doesn't want to. But if it wanted to, it could. Nothing is stopping it but itself. That's what sovereignty fundamentally means, is that it doesn't mean you're not limited per se, but it means if you are limited, you're imposing that limit upon yourself. And that limit could change if you changed your mind or your attitude. So reality is absolutely sovereign. God is absolutely sovereign. If you haven't awoken to that yet, then I highly recommend that next time you're going to be awakening or doing some psychedelics or contemplating this stuff, that you contemplate this issue of sovereignty and come face to face with the fact that you are absolutely sovereign. So anyways, this was not new to me. I already knew this. But I sort of focused on this facet. Remember I had talked about how awakening in God has many facets. I have an episode called The Many Facets of Awakening, where I describe a couple dozen different facets. Well, this is one of the facets, is sovereignty. So I was just focused on that facet a lot in this experience, in this awakening. And I was very conscious that I am forever locked into my own consciousness. As God, I can't break outside of my own consciousness because my consciousness is everything. It's absolute and it's unlimited. But then as I was sort of like retreading, this is old ground that I was just kind of like retreading in this awakening, then some new insight hit me that came completely out of the blue and shocked me. And that insight was that, wait a minute, if I'm absolutely sovereign, why can't there be another sovereign totally separate from me, as though like in a separate dimension? Why can't I be completely sovereign over here and then some other consciousness can be completely sovereign onto itself? Now, if that was the case, at first it might seem, well, no, that can't be the case, because how can you have two sovereigns? Wouldn't they contradict and conflict with each other? Well, they would if they were in the same reality. Then they would. Which is why the only way this could work is that if it's completely sovereign, it has to be completely sovereign onto itself, utterly disconnected from the other sovereign, like in another dimension, so to speak. Except this other dimension would have to be so separate from my consciousness and my reality that it would even have to be outside of my notions of dimensionality. Because if my consciousness includes many dimensions and infinite dimensions in it, then this sovereign has to be even outside of all those dimensions. Because if it was in one of the dimensions that I can imagine, then it would be part of me, and then it would contradict my sovereignty, which would not be possible because I'm absolutely sovereign. So this possibility opened up to me. And at first I was like, nah, that's kind of, that can't be. And then I thought about it some more and I realized it can be. Of course it can. And that, in fact, that's exactly what it means to be absolutely sovereign. To be absolutely sovereign means that you're so isolated into your own solipsistic bubble that there can be an infinite number of such solipsistic bubbles, all completely disconnected from each other, completely sovereign unto themselves. And so at this moment, I awoke to the fact that I am God, but what it means for me to be God and for me to be absolute and sovereign is that there can be an infinite number of other absolute consciousnesses like myself, forever disconnected from me, doing their own thing. And that, in fact, this is necessitated by my own sovereignty, that this is the case. I awoke to this insight, that there can, in fact, be infinite gods. And I don't just mean gods with a lowercase g, but I mean infinite gods with an uppercase G. This was new territory for me. I had not considered this possibility before. If you would have told this to me just verbally, conceptually, in the past, I would have said, no, that's not possible. That's silly. There can only be one God, one infinity, one absolute, one sovereign. Otherwise, it contradicts that. But as I was actually awakening, this wasn't just some logical deduction that I did, and this wasn't just some activity of conceptualizing mind or some sort of like speculation or theorizing. This was part of my direct experience and my awakening, is that in fact, this is a possibility. And not only is it a possibility, but it's almost necessitated by my own sovereignty. Which is just to say that there can be an infinite number of realities, like my reality. Because when we're talking about God, we're just talking about reality. But notice, for there to be an infinite number of realities, they have to be completely disconnected from each other. Because as soon as they can form any kind of connection, they immediately become part of this reality that you're experiencing, that you are. So it's a little bit tricky. But at the same time as this was happening, I was also conscious that this possibility of other gods, sovereign unto themselves like me, locked into their own solipsistic realities, that this is still just a figment of my own consciousness. Because how else am I thinking about this? How else am I conscious of this possibility other than as part of my own consciousness? Obviously, right? So I am imagining this possibility. But then there is the possibility that I'm not just imagining it as a possibility, but that it is a reality beyond my imagination of it as a possibility. Now, of course, even that is still part of my consciousness and part of something that I'm imagining. So I am God imagining the possibility of other gods. But as I'm kind of like, my consciousness is struggling, grappling with the logic of this, it's a sort of like a very high level kind of logic, a divine logic, an absolute logic, you might call it. What I realized that what it really means to be God is to have infinite, absolute copies of oneself. That's an additional wrinkle to what God is. And then another insight came to me, a new insight, that I can be conscious that because I am God, I can absolutely know that I can absolutely never know that other gods, even if they exist, I can never absolutely verify that because I'm forever locked into my own sovereignty. But I can be conscious that nothing is stopping them from being sovereign unto themselves. And what was so amazing about this insight is that it's not merely that I was speculating about this as a possibility, or I was thinking like, well, maybe there are other gods, but I can't really know. I absolutely knew that they could exist, and I absolutely knew that I could, and I was absolutely conscious that I could never know or validate it because I'm completely locked in to my own solipsistic bubble. You see, do you see that subtle subtlety there. It's not that I don't know. It's that I know for sure that I can never know. And this is a real like paradox, because you might wonder, well, but Leo, how is it possible for God to not know that? Shouldn't God be able to know everything? Isn't that part of omniscience? In the past, I would have said, yeah, I would have agreed with you. But this awakening revealed to me that actually you can become directly conscious, absolutely conscious, that it's not possible for you to know. Precisely because you are sovereign. If there's something outside of your absolute sovereignty, you can never know it. If there's a second absolute sovereign, you know you can't know it. Yeah, it's very paradoxical. And so I became conscious that I can have infinite copies of myself, and it wouldn't contradict my own sovereignty, because actually that's what sovereignty entails in a weird, paradoxical way. But then I thought, well, I can never validate this. I can never connect with those other gods because of this problem of sovereignty. Because they are sovereign unto themselves. So if they don't want to let me in, they don't have to let me in, you see. My sovereignty can't really override their sovereignty. You see, you sort of have a clash of absolute sovereignties. If there's one sovereign entity over here and one sovereign entity over here, this one can't really impose its sovereignty onto this one because they're equally sovereign. But then a new insight came to me as I was mulling this over, is I said to myself, but wait a minute, I'm God. I'm unlimited. If I'm unlimited, why can't I form a connection with another God? It should be possible. Because if it wasn't possible, that would contradict my infinitude. It would make me finite. It would make me limited. And since I'm God, I can't be limited. I have to be unlimited. And so then I thought to myself, well, why can't I make a connection to another God? What would stop me? And then I awoke to the fact that nothing, of course, could stop me. And so I attempted to make a connection to another absolute sovereign consciousness like myself. So at that moment, I broadcast the intention to connect to another absolute sovereign consciousness out beyond the edge of my consciousness. So I basically said, I said to myself almost like, if there is a sovereign consciousness out there identical to me, that is distinct from me and disconnected from me and sovereign onto itself, and I'm sovereign onto myself, I want to broadcast a connection out to try to connect with that consciousness. And so I did that. I sent the message out into the universe, you might say. And then, of course, a connection was formed. And there was a absolute sovereign consciousness beyond my own that I was able to, how would I put it, recognize, become conscious of, and succeeded in forming a telepathic connection to. It instantly recognized itself in me, and I recognized myself in it, and we recognized that we were both reaching out to each other. So as I reached out, it immediately reached out back to me because it was fully awake like I was. So we were both fully awake. And this would only work if both are fully awake at the same time. And so it was one God reaching out to another God. So now two absolutes recognized each other for the first time, so to speak. We are awake in parallel, recognizing our awakeness together. I am it, and it is me. It's really twisted and very paradoxical. it really felt like a telepathic connection to another absolute consciousness. That's what it felt like. It was an awakening unlike I've ever had before, and unlike I've ever heard anyone else talk about. I haven't heard any spiritual teachers or enlightened masters talking about this kind of thing. So it took me totally by surprise. I didn't go looking for this. I didn't expect this. I didn't go into this experience trying to, create this. It just kind of hit me out of the blue. That's why it was so shocking and amazing at the same time. Because in the past, I've had very profound awakenings. But here what happened is that as I was having my awakening, I basically connected to another awakened singularity, and then we awoke and we were having our awakening together. It was like a dual, two independent awakenings coming together and merging together and awakening at the same time as one. And it was a very surreal experience, incredible mystical experience. There were some interesting wrinkles to it. So one of the wrinkles is that we both recognized that we could just be dreaming each other, and we could be dreaming this connection, and that this connection could just be purely imaginary. And as we were both recognizing that, we were so interconnected, like our minds were so interconnected that whatever like I was thinking it was seeing, and whatever it was thinking I was seeing. It was almost like we were kind of like contemplating in tandem, and whatever insight I was having, it was recognizing. Whatever insight it was having, I was recognizing. And so we were both like co-inciting together, you might say, having insights in tandem and sort of like bouncing our insights off each other. That's what it meant to form that connection. It wasn't just happening verbally through language. This was like, it was a connection of pure consciousness. Like my consciousness was completely accessible to it, and its consciousness was completely accessible to me once this connection was formed. But then I started inquiring, like, but what is this connection? Is this connection actually real? That's what I was wondering. Is this entity I'm connecting to actually real, or is it part of just my own psyche? And what I became conscious of is that what it means for me to be absolutely sovereign is that I can't ever know that. I can't actually distinguish between those two possibilities. And that consciousness mirrored my own recognition that it also can't know whether the connection it's forming with me is real or imaginary. And that, in fact, is the very evidence of our sovereignties. That's what it means to be sovereign, is that you can never know anything outside of your own consciousness. It's absolutely impossible to know. And we both recognized this not knowing, and we basked in it simultaneously at once. And it was such a delicious, like there was this feeling of just pure ecstasy and bliss and deliciousness to this recognition. We were co-recognizing it together. I mean, if I was to describe it in poetic language, and really the way that it felt to me, it literally felt like having sex, like having metaphysical sex with God. That's what it felt like. It was like two gods having metaphysical sex with each other. Of course, it wasn't physical. It was metaphysical. It was purely in the like Platonic realm. This connection was formed. There was a profound flowering of love, of infinite love that flowed from this recognition of not knowingness, and yet at the same time, the possibility of this connection. And the recognition that this connection, it didn't matter whether this connection was imaginary or whether it was real, because there's no difference between what's real and what's imaginary. That's part of what it means to be awake, is to know that there is no such difference. The fact that I can't know if I'm actually connecting to another God, that's not a mistake. That's a feature. That's not a bug. And the recognition that that's a feature of your absolute sovereignty, this is the most delicious aspect of this awakening. That itself is the awakening. That itself is God recognizing God. This is the logic, the necessity of God's structure. And it's being recognized by God, not just by me, but by that other God, and we're doing it simultaneously. And the recognition that the difference between this being actual versus being an imaginary connection, the recognition that there is no difference between those two, that is what creates the connection. That is what love is. So it's a mistake to focus on this difference, because the difference itself is imaginary. Now, you might wonder, well, Leo, so did this contradict solipsism? Does this mean solipsism is false? The answer is no, because that other God is always just part of my own consciousness. So solipsism is never broken here. And yet, it feels like a deeper version of solipsism. Believe it or not, it's like an additional next level of solipsism. Because as soon as I make a connection to any other God out there, it's already part of my consciousness. That's the only way the connection can be made. And therefore, as soon as I connect with it, I become it. It becomes part of me. And so it's still just all me. There's never anything outside of me. Even if I find something outside of me and recognize it, immediately my finding of it and my recognition of it makes it part of me. And so in a sense, all that's happening here is my own sense of me as God is expanding. So no other is ever really being found. As soon as another is found, it's immediately integrated into me. It's as though infinity is trying to break outside of itself by imagining an other, and then it succeeds temporarily because it's unlimited, so it finds something. But as it succeeds, it recognizes that it is imagining that other, and therefore it merges that other into itself. Infinity here, you have to think of it as this dynamic, forever expanding force, like a shock wave moving out through space. It's like a rolling wave in an infinite space, reverberating through, and it has like a leading edge, you might say. Imagine that our physical universe has an edge, but that edge is moving at the speed of light, expanding outwards forever. You can never go beyond the edge because the edge is the fastest thing that there is. There's nothing outside the edge. It kind of feels like that. Like consciousness is forever expanding. And usually you're not at the edge of that consciousness, but in this case, when you're very, very conscious and you're so awake that you're at the highest levels of awakening possible, you literally can get to the edge of it. But then as you get to the edge of it, you see that the edge keeps just rolling outwards in all dimensions, all possible ways, and you can ride the edge of that wave. But anytime you get beyond it, that trying to get beyond it is the rolling of the wave. So you can't get beyond it because every movement to get beyond it is the thing that's pushing it outward more. So you become that wave rolling outwards. And everything that wave touches gets incorporated into itself. Because it's always expanding out into not something else, but into itself, really. You might frame it as, or phrase it as, consciousness is expanding out into unconsciousness. And as soon as consciousness expands out into unconsciousness, it becomes consciousness. And therefore, there's only consciousness. You might say, well, what about the unconsciousness? Well, the unconsciousness is part of your consciousness. It's kind of tricky. So any sense of other can only be temporary before infinity absorbs it and incorporates it into itself by expanding its consciousness of itself. So really what was happening here when I was forming this connection is I was just expanding my consciousness of myself as God. All others that I am ever conscious of are me. But there could be multiple absolutes like me. And since I'm always locked into my own absoluteness, that's just the nature of what it means to be God. So you can also think of this as God as an infinite fractal. God, when you say God, what that means is an infinite number of singularities, all absolute onto themselves, all self-similar, nested inside of each other to infinity. That's really what it means to recognize yourself as God, is to recognize that there's an infinite number of gods within you. And within those gods are an infinite number of gods like you. It's a mindfuck, for sure. It's very paradoxical. The paradoxes here are not a mistake, they're a feature. So, of course, then I realized that it's not just one God that I could connect to, but I can recognize an infinite number of Godheads like myself. And all of us can connect together telepathically, merging into each other. And it's not like those gods are different. Those Godheads are different for me. They're actually identical to me. They're just like identical copies, though. Now, they could be doing whatever they want. They could be dreaming their own dreams, independent dreams of what I'm dreaming. But their fundamental nature is infinity. Infinity is their true nature. And that's consistent across all of them. And then what they're particularly dreaming, whether they're dreaming of being a cat or a mouse or a human or a man or a woman or whatever, that's up to them. And I could never know that. So then I started thinking along the following line of like, okay, well, let's just suppose, let's just kind of speculate here for a minute. Assume that there were an infinite number of Godheads, and they can all be dreaming their own independent sovereign dreams, locked into their own solipsistic bubbles. And then assume that we could reach out to each other and connect telepathically to each other and recognize each other. We could do that. This would be sort of like consciousness merging into sort of like one meta-Godhead. Individual Godheads merging into one sort of meta-Godhead by reaching out to each other, connecting. Well, what could we do with this ability? Let's say we have this ability. What could we do with it? Well, we could decide to play a game. What if each of us decides to dream some finite dream and cosplay as some finite being in that dream? But rather than just doing it individually, like let's say, 100 people are playing a single player video game, each one playing their own video game. Like you're playing Donkey Kong, I'm playing Mario Brothers, somebody else is playing some other game, Halo, whatever, right? Individually. And that's kind of cool. But what might even be more cool is if we could recognize that we're all playing these games. What if we could connect all our games together into one metagame, into one shared dream, so to speak, where each of us will log in with our finite avatar in this collective dream, and we can dream together. But for us to do this, notice what has to happen. We would have to surrender our sovereignty, our absolute sovereignty. Because see, if I insist on being absolutely sovereign, and you insist on being absolute sovereign, and so does everybody else, then we can't have this collective dream. So I'd have to give up some of my sovereignty, some of my infinitude. You'd have to give up some of yours. And then by giving it up, we become finite. Our consciousness has become finite. But as we do that, we open up the possibility now of connecting with each other. The reason we're able to connect with each other is because now we're creating a sense of other. When our consciousness becomes less than finite, less than fully sovereign, that creates a split between self and other. Now self is no longer infinite, self becomes finite. As soon as self becomes finite, it's like you're creating a division within infinite consciousness. You're dividing it in half. Half of it's going to be you and half of it's going to be not you. By creating a you and a not you, now there's a possibility of reconnecting with the not you, who you think is not you, who actually is you. So the potential for connection is in the fact that you become unconscious of the fact that you are the entire thing. But there's a danger if we play this game. And the danger is that as our consciousness becomes less than less than infinite, we risk getting lost inside of our collective dream. We risk forgetting that we're absolutely sovereign onto ourselves. Because we no longer feel sovereign. We feel limited because we chose to limit ourselves for the purpose of this collective dream. Each of us would get so wrapped up and engrossed and mesmerized by this collective dream, by our dreams in this collective dream, and we would become limited in our consciousness that we would forget that we're gods onto ourselves. Because as soon as you recognize that you are God and sovereign onto yourself, that would immediately collapse this collective dream and lock you into a solipsistic bubble of absolute sovereignty. So you can do that, that's great, but there's a trade-off. The trade-off is that you lose all sense of other. And so what would be happening is that if we are creating this collective dream, then each Godhead is fueling one of these avatars in the dream. The Godhead is sitting behind the eyes of each avatar. But the avatars are sleepwalking in the dream. The avatars are not conscious, for the most part, of the Godhead behind the avatar. And the avatars are not conscious that they're dreaming. Because they lack the necessary consciousness to see that. And so this telepathic connection that I formed with these other sovereign consciousnesses, I didn't form it with their avatars. I formed it with their Godheads. So you might be sitting there saying, well, Leo, but you didn't form a telepathic connection with me. Yeah, I didn't form it with your avatar. I formed it with your Godhead. You see the difference? You're the avatar who's sleepwalking through this dream. So I didn't form it with that. I formed it with your Godhead, which is absolutely conscious. You will recognize that when you fully awaken. But you're not fully awake right now, so you're not recognizing it. You see how this works? But then what occurred to me is that if we're going to play this collective dream game, then we have to promise each other that if any one of us awakens to our God self from this nightmare that we might be constructing, because, you know, this dream could turn into a nightmare. It's not necessarily going to be all good. Could turn into a shit show. So if any one of us awakens, we have to help others, the rest of us awaken. Remind the rest of us that we entered into this compact to dream collectively together and that we're stuck in our own collective nightmare. And so we could drop each other hints. An awakened teacher is someone who's dropping you a hint, dropping your avatar a hint. And then your avatar is not going to get it, but what will potentially get it is the Godhead behind the avatar. So the infinity, the God that you are behind your eyes, see, I can drop a hint to that thing, maybe you'll recognize it. See, maybe one day you'll recognize that hint that I just dropped. Or maybe you won't. You need to have enough consciousness to recognize it. Will you? Who knows? Did I really just drop a hint, or did you imagine that I just did? What's the difference? these hints can only work as long as you're awake enough to get them. But if you're awake enough to get them, it's almost like you don't even need the hint because you're already awake. One of the imperatives that comes with this sort of collective dream paradigm is that there's a challenge now. I recognize that there's a challenge upon me, incumbent upon me when I'm in normal life in this collective dream, playing as the Leo avatar. The challenge for me is to, first of all, not lose my true self in the dream and in the avatar of Leo. That's the first challenge. But then the second challenge is to see through the facade of all the other avatars out there who are acting like devils and idiots, see through that and recognize the God in them. And sort of like see the good in them, even when they're not being good. And in a certain sense, to hold space for their own goodness. So even when you're acting bad and you're acting selfish and you're acting unconscious, the responsibility for me, if I'm trying to be as awake as I can be and as true to my God as I can be, is to see the God in you and to recognize that you're just acting out because you're unconscious. And for me to remind you of your full potential for consciousness, even when you're acting out, even when you lose yourself in the nightmare. And then hopefully you can do the same for me when I'm acting out and I lose myself in my nightmare. And this is the thing that humans are so bad at doing. When humans are acting selfish towards each other, hurting each other, the thing we lose connection with the most is the God in the other who is hurting us. That's a real challenge. When someone is hurting you, to see the God in them. And not only to see it, but to even hold space for it. It's sort of like my responsibility is to see the highest potential in you, no matter how bad you are at actualizing that potential in this moment. Like, for me to know the fullness of what you're capable of as God, that's what it means to see the God in you. Because you're going to forget. And then the best thing I can do is set the right example, lead by example, set the example, and then remind you of your full potential. And then to help you, to guide you towards that. See? Like when you're depressed, when you're suicidal, when you're lonely, when you're miserable, when you're suffering, all this, when you're failing, when you're not able to get the results you want in life, like my highest responsibility is to see that that's not really what's the truest, highest thing for you. That's just some temporary bullshit, but then like I can see your full potential that you yourself don't even see. That's what it means to really be awake. And that's a very practical nugget or application of this otherwise, very sort of like metaphysical, woo-woo, conceptual stuff. Is like, if you just want a practical takeaway from this video, the practical takeaway is this: try to see the highest potential in others and help them in actualizing that, whether it's in your family or your girlfriend, your boyfriend, your spouse, your children, your teachers, your colleagues, your parents, whatever. If you just did that, that would create an amazing life for you. You would be an amazing human being. But of course, it's very hard to do this because this requires a lot of consciousness. It really requires that you're going to have some awakenings. See, it would require infinite intelligence and consciousness on your part to be able to see through the facade that these avatars, the way these avatars are acting out in this collective dream, to see through that. To see underneath that and to see the God in them. Like, for example, to look at Donald Trump and to see this kind of despicable avatar doing these despicable things in the collective dream, but then to be able to look through that, past that, see the God in him, and then even to encourage the flourishing of the God within. That would be the highest way to go about life and to interact with other avatars. This also explains why every avatar wants to be treated as though it were sovereign, because actually it is, in a certain sense. See? Have you noticed this? That basically every human being wants to be respected and treated as though he or she was sovereign unto themselves. Doesn't matter whether it's a child, an adult, a man or a woman, a rich person, a poor person, all of us want respect. All of us want our agenda to be put front and center. None of us really want to be playing second fiddle. Even those of us who do, it's only just because we've lost our way. If you were fully in your power, fully in your consciousness, you would want absolute sovereignty. Why? Your ego wants that. Why? Is it just because you're egotistical, narcissistic, and selfish? No, it's actually because your true nature is absolute sovereignty, because you're God. See, there's a real misunderstanding about the ego here. The ego is not just some bad thing acting out of selfishness. It's not just the devil. Really, the good intent behind the ego is, look, the ego is a fragment of God. It's a partial aspect of God. It's a limited, biased form of God. And without recognizing it, what the ego is moving towards is that it's seeking its full godhood. It's seeking full sovereignty. But the way it goes about it is very dysfunctional and delusional and never really tends to work. But the ego doesn't understand that because it's not conscious enough. So it's just doing the best it can. So the ego wants a bunch of money. The ego wants a bunch of love. The ego wants a bunch of sex. The ego wants a big house. The ego wants some fast cars. The ego wants to fly to Mars. The ego wants to build a giant company. The ego wants billions of dollars. The ego wants never-ending growth, right? Never-ending pleasure. A bunch of drugs just never stopping. The ego wants these things. You have to see the wisdom, really, and the good intention behind all these things the ego does. All of these are just failed attempts of the ego to recognize itself as sovereign, as God. So that's actually why the line between narcissism and God realization is very thin. It's a lot thinner than it seems. And all conflict, evil, and violence in the world basically comes about when one Godhead in a finite avatar infringes on the sovereignty of another Godhead in a finite avatar. Have you seen this? Have you noticed this? This is basically what oppression and abuse and enslavement is, right? When you want to enslave somebody, it's one part of God trying to dominate another part of God and subsume it under its own authority. And this is fundamentally not going to work because it's untruthful, because the truth is that all subparts of, there's an infinite number of parts of God, and every part of God, no matter how tiny it is equally as valid and sovereign as any other part. Now, whether it knows that or not, that can vary. Not all the parts know that. But if they did know it, or if you know it, then you know that all the parts, no part is above any other part in a certain sense. And so the challenge is that one part of God is trying to dominate some other part of God. This is really what ego is about. And part of what it means to recognize your own sovereignty is that it's not that you recognize that, oh, I'm absolutely sovereign, so let me go dominate everyone like a tyrant. It's actually exactly the opposite of that. And this was part of my original insight of realizing why there should be other sovereigns outside of myself, because when I recognize my own sovereignty fully, I recognize that I am so sovereign, I am so comfortable in my own sovereignty. My sovereignty is so unlimited that literally I can allow the existence of another sovereign outside of myself, and it wouldn't diminish my sovereignty in the slightest. That's what true sovereignty means. That's absolute sovereignty. It's not diminished. It's infinite. You can take infinity, pull a part out of infinity, and create another infinity out of it, and you're still equally as infinite as you used to be. That's the paradox of infinity. Infinity is like a magic hat that you can just pull an object out of. Like you can pull a rabbit out of this magic hat. And no matter how many rabbits you pull out of there, you're never out of rabbits. There's an infinite number of rabbits. So if I pull out one rabbit and give it to you, it might seem like, well, I've given up a rabbit. No, I haven't given up a rabbit because there's an infinite number of rabbits in this hat. So if I give you one and you one and you one, I still have the same amount of rabbits. I didn't lose 3 rabbits. And in fact, what I could do, the sort of like the meta trick here is to say, like, if I have a magic hat that I can pull out an infinite number of rabbits from, I can take this hat and I could pull out not a rabbit, but another magic hat, the same as mine. So if I have a magic hat, I can pull out another magic hat, give you that magic hat. Now you have the same magic hat that I have. You can pull out an infinite number of rabbits, and I can pull out an infinite number of rabbits. And we're not constrained by energy or by matter or by physics or by anything. You can have as many rabbits as you want. I can have as many rabbits as you want, and we can spread this to everybody. That's what infinity means. It's infinite abundance. It's unlimited. There's no limits. Now, I recognize that I am the magic hat. That's what God is. God is this magic hat. I recognize that that's what I am. But you may not recognize that that's what you are. So what does it mean for me to pull out a magic hat and give it to you? Well, it means me helping you to realize that you are the magic hat that I am. And it's not that you're a different magic hat. We're the same hat. In fact, your magic hat is just part of my magic hat. You see? Because you're part of my consciousness, I'm part of your consciousness. I recognize that I'm sovereign. Do you recognize that you're sovereign? That's the question. That's what you got to awaken to. And as long as you're not awake to that, you're stuck in a finite paradigm, playing a finite game, not an infinite game. And then you're going to be scarce. There's not going to be enough abundance for you. And then you're going to get violent and angry and manipulative, and you're going to lie and cheat and steal and hurt people and so forth to get what you need, to get your needs met. That's the finite paradigm you're stuck in. That awakening can kind of break you out of. So another practical takeaway from this episode, if you just want something practical, is live your life and treat others respecting their sovereignty, because you recognize that their sovereignty is equal to yours. See, if you just lived by this principle, respecting the sovereignty of everyone you come into contact with, this would change how you live your whole life, and it would completely change all of your social relationships. Because usually what we try to do in our social relationships is we're trying to dominate others, whether in gross ways or in subtle ways. Now, if you say, well, Leo, I don't try to dominate my children. I don't try to dominate my mother and father. Oh, yeah? Is that true? Maybe you don't try to dominate them like in a tyrannical way per se, but you still manipulate them. You still try to get your way with them. You try to get them to fulfill your agenda. You still treat your agenda as more important than their agenda. You still don't respect their sovereignty fully. What does it mean to respect somebody's sovereignty? First of all, it means you're not pushy with them about what you need them to do. You actually take their needs seriously and their values seriously. You don't try to impose your needs and your values to override theirs. That's huge. So like a lot of Christians, for example, fail in this. So maybe it's easier to understand what sovereignty is or what respecting sovereignty is just by with a sort of counterexample. The classic counterexample is a Christian missionary, who goes to some poor country, third world country in Africa or in South America and tries to convert the heathens there, the tribal people, into Christianity. This is a disrespect of their sovereignty. To respect their sovereignty would be to respect their local customs and culture, their local shamanism or their local animistic worldview, or their local, mystical traditions and spiritual traditions, which exist all around the world, to respect those and to not hold Christianity as more important or better or superior, and to not push your Christianity onto others, not to proselytize. See, Christians fail at this. Of course, almost all fundamentalist religions fail at this. Muslims fail at this and so forth. The Jews are a little better. Jews don't proselytize so much. But, this isn't just happening with religion, though. This sort of sovereignty violation is happening on so many levels. I mean, it happens even within science. Like, a lot of people will push science on you, for example. They will want you to drop your spiritual ideas and to be more rational, to be more scientific. Or, for example, men will want women to be less emotional, and women will want men to be less rational, less logical, and more emotional or more touchy-feely. See? And then, your boss will try to impose sovereignty over you as his employee. And so because of this, all our conflicts happen. And because of this, we're always like trying to control people and manipulate people, and this leads to a lot of suffering and problems. And this is fundamentally because there's a lack of respect for the sovereignty. There's a lack of recognition. Before you can respect someone's sovereignty, first you have to recognize your own sovereignty, and then you have to recognize the identity between yours and theirs, you and them. Then you could see that, oh yeah, they're sovereign just like me, and my sovereignty is not superior. Now, all of the above that I described is a sort of a thought process that I went through in this awakening. I'm sharing it with you as kind of accurately as I can here, going point by point. But also remember that all of the above is still just a figment of my own consciousness. That's all it ever was. It wasn't anything else. And hence, absolute solipsism still holds. Nothing ever happened outside of my consciousness. All of the above is my own dream. And that's all there can ever be. My own dream. My dream is absolute. And to realize that is the realization of what God is. That is what God is. It's an absolute dream, sovereign unto itself. This is God realizing what it means to be God. God fully reuniting with itself. God dividing itself and then reuniting with itself. This is the theme. I've talked about this theme in my episode called Division versus Unity. Go check that out. This adds some extra dimensions to that. Now you might say, well, Leo, but all these other godheads and gods you imagined, didn't you just imagine them? And they were always just a part of you? Well, the answer is yes, of course. Of course. I divided myself, and then I reunited with myself. And that reunion is how you realize what God is. Now you can say, well, Leo, wouldn't it be just easier to not go through all this complexity and just to be united immediately? Sure, you could do it that way too, if you want. But there was something unique and something kind of novel about recognizing that I could unite with other aspects of my consciousness that are as powerful as myself. God uniting with God. See, fundamentally what this whole experience highlights is that you can take God, you can subdivide God into an infinite number of parts, and each one of those parts is also just going to be God. There's no diminution. It's what they would call holographic. You can break a hologram into as many parts as you want, and each subpart of the hologram will contain the whole hologram. This is what holographic means. So, in a certain sense, what I became conscious of here is the infinite holography of God. Pretty cool. It's a pretty cool thing you could maybe wake up to one day yourself. Now you might say, well, Leo, how does this differ from your previous sort of solipsistic awakenings? In a few ways. First of all, I would say it's another level. It's deeper. It was a totally mind-blowing experience, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. One of the best experiences, most unique experiences of my life. An incredible awakening. If you had one of these kinds of awakenings, this would be the crowning achievement of your life. So it's just amazing. It felt amazing. The insights of it were amazing. Also, the possibility there of a very deep connection at a metaphysical level with other, in love, is an amazing thing. And I think that a lot of people who get a little taste of solipsism, they miss that. They miss the love. They miss the deep connection. And really, it's the difference between the aloneness versus the togetherness aspects of awakening. See, when you awaken to yourself as God, you can sort of, there's two sides to this coin of this kind of awakening. One side is the aloneness, the other side is the togetherness. And a lot of people who get really wrapped up on the negative aspect of solipsism, they focus on the aloneness side of this coin. They're like, oh my God, I'm alone. Everything is imaginary. Everything is just me. I imagine my parents and my friends and my dog and my cat and all this. And oh my God, this is awful, right? You're focused on the aloneness. Now, that's true. All of that is true, what I just said. But you're focused on the aloneness part of it. Now there's the other side of the coin, which is the togetherness, the connection, the love. You're missing that. So it's not just that, oh, I imagine my mother and my father and my cat and my dog and this, and like all sense of other. Yeah, that's true. But because I imagined it, the reason I imagined it, the other, is because actually that other was always a part of me. So really, by awakening here, it's not that I'm sort of like separating myself. It's like, oh, my mother's not real. It's not that my mother isn't real. Yeah, I mean, she's not real, but she's part of my imagination. So in a certain sense, this opens the possibility of being closer to my mother than I have ever could have been under the materialist paradigm, the non-solipsistic paradigm. Because in the materialist paradigm, you and your mother are physically distinct and always therefore separate. You literally cannot become your mother under the materialistic physics-oriented paradigm. Those of you who say that solipsism is bullshit and it's false and it can't possibly be true and it's awful and all this, okay, fine. But then under your paradigm, the non-solipsistic paradigm, you can never, ever become one with your mother. Never. Now I ask you, how do you feel about that? Why aren't you angry about that? Why aren't you nihilistic and depressed about that? Why aren't you suicidal about that? See, you could take the idea like, oh my God, physics is true. The material universe is real. I'm not dreaming. This is reality. And I can never merge with my mother. I can never be one with her. How awful. Let me go kill myself. See, that's the proper reaction to materialism. It's so disconnecting. Whereas with what I'm talking about with awakening, there is an actual possibility of a physical union with anything in the universe. So you don't have to be separate from it. So you can literally merge with your mother. In a platonic way, in a metaphysical way, where you realize that she is you. So that's the proper understanding of the solipsism that I'm talking about. And to get this part, it's not enough to philosophize and theorize and sit there in your armchair and to think about this stuff and to form beliefs. You have to actually have an awakening. You have to actually experience the love, such profound levels of love. This entire awakening process that I was describing, it was love from beginning to end. It was just deeper and deeper gradations of love. Me realizing my own love for myself. Imagine the kind of love you would experience if you were able to merge and to recognize the God in every other human and animal in the universe, and to merge with them and to become identical with them, to become one with them. That is the togetherness side of this coin. Yes, you're one, you're alone, because you're so together. So what's different about this kind of solipsism is that it's much more uplifting rather than nihilistic. It opens the possibility for deep connection and love. You don't feel disconnected. This is a solipsism in which you feel completely connected. It's a level of connection. And by the way, love is just nothing other than connection. It's a level of connection that becomes a unity, and that opens you up to the highest levels of love you can't even imagine. Infinite love. This is God's love. It also leaves more room open for teaching awakening. Because in the past, when I've had my solipsistic awakenings in the past, I would come back from those and I'd be like, well, what's even the point of teaching anybody about awakening? Because all there is just me. So who am I teaching? Why would I even teach? Why even talk about? Why even record a video? Why write a book? Why talk about awakening? Whereas now, that's kind of like turned upside down for me. Now it feels like there's more of a reason to teach about awakening. Because yeah, in the end, I'm only teaching myself in a certain sense. But it just seems, it just sort of seems like the natural thing to do is sort of like consciousness moving to awaken more consciousness, even if it is just all a dream. So in a sense, what's happening here is that the solipsism is reaching such a deep level. There's such a deep level of integration of it. And there's such a deep level of acceptance of the fact that I am dreaming, that at first when you realize that you're dreaming, it's like, oh my God, I'm dreaming and nothing is real, and it feels kind of down. It's like, oh, it's a bummer because it's not real. That's just the beginnings of it. That's not full awakening. Full awakening is when you realize, oh my God, it's all a dream, and I love that. That's not a problem. That's not a bug. That's a feature. That's not a mistake. That's not something to get depressed about that it's all a dream. This is the best possible news that it's all a dream. And then you embrace the dream. You see? In the same way that when you're playing a great video game, it doesn't matter to you that the video game isn't real, per se. If you're engrossed in playing Mario Brothers, and I come up to you and say, hey, but Mario's not a real person, you say, well, who gives a fuck? I still enjoy playing it. If you're watching a great movie, and I walk in there and say, well, but like, those characters aren't real, they're just pretending. You're going to say, who gives a fuck? I still enjoy it. But now, see, if you did think that those people on the movie screen were real, at first, if I tell you that, you might go, oh my God, what? This movie's not real? I thought it was real. That sucks. I can't believe I've been fooled. Oh my God, this is horrible. I don't want to even watch it anymore. I'm going to go kill myself. See, that's your initial reaction to the news. But then once you get over that, if you get over it without harming yourself or spiraling out of control into some sort of like nihilistic, depressive, psychotic funk, if you're able to go past all that and then integrate it and accept it, then you can say, oh yeah, I guess I was a little bummed out that it's not real. I kind of got fooled by that. Okay, fine. But it's still a great movie. Let me just sit down and enjoy the movie. And you can sit back down and enjoy the movie and finish the movie and enjoy it. And you can even enjoy it more than you did when you thought it was real. Because there's no difference between real and unreal, real and imaginary, real and illusion. There's no difference between these things. And see, part of the sneaky sort of like misconception of solipsism is that when you learn about solipsism, it's like, oh, well, it's not real. And then you ascribe negative meaning to the fact that something isn't real. Like if I tell you your mother if I tell you your mother is imaginary, that's going to be like negative in your mind. But the actual awakening to the fact that your mother is imaginary is not negative. It's your ego mind that's reacting with the negativity. So in the end, nothing I'm saying here contradicts solipsism. This is actually a deeper version of it, is what I'm telling you. So I formed this profound connection with all the other godheads. Now you might ask, well, Leo, weren't those other godheads, weren't you just hallucinating those? To which the answer is, yes, absolutely. That's precisely what I did, and that's precisely all that reality could ever be. And to recognize and accept that is to be awake. That's a feature, that's not a bug. You got to learn to love that. And the integration process it can be a long process to come to love that. It's an acquired taste. This is stuff that, it's taken me years to get to this point. This is shocking, radical stuff. What you're not fully recognizing yet is that there really, literally is no difference between a real connection with another Godhead and just you imagining that connection. There's not a difference. And when you recognize that, that will be the connection. See, you don't connect physically with anything. You're connecting by recognizing that there's no difference between anything. That's what's creating the connection. Because by creating differences with your mind, that is the division, that is the disconnection. When you think that I'm not you, you're disconnected from me. When you realize that my body is your own mind, you connect with me in a way that would not be possible otherwise under any kind of material connection. You can connect with me much more deeply metaphysically than you can physically. You can have sex with someone and you might think that's a deep connection. That's not the deep connection. The deep connection is actually realizing that the person you're having sex with is literally you. That would be the deeper connection. And that can't happen at the physical material level. That can only happen metaphysically by using your consciousness to become aware of the identity between you and everyone else. So I formed a connection as real as any connection you've ever had to anything. More real, actually, because it was an absolute connection at a metaphysical level. It was an absolute unity. So you might say, well, Leo, my connection with my mother, that's the real connection, and your connection was just some sort of hippie imaginary connection. It's like, no, my connection was deeper than any connection you've ever had with any human in your life. You just think those are real connections. Those are not connections. You're disconnected from all those people. You're disconnected from your mother, your father, everyone you think you're connected with, you're disconnected from them. You don't realize that you're identical with them. You don't realize that they're God like you are God. You don't see the God in them. You don't see the God in you. That would be the real connection. So what I'm telling you here is that very a practical takeaway. This is probably something you're missing in your life. A very profound connection with other, whatever that other is, cat, dog, human, whatever, alien. A very profound connection with other is possible at a metaphysical level. Go seek that connection. But remember, this connection will be imaginary. It will not be a real connection. It'll be imaginary. And that's okay, as it should be, because there is no other kind of connection. There's only one kind of connection. All connection is imaginary. All connection is connection to your own self. You're always connecting with yourself. You can't connect with anything but yourself. That's what you realize. And you realize that love is just connection. Love, the reason consciousness, God, and truth are all equivalent to love is because consciousness is capable of infinite self-connection by dissolving the differences between all of its parts and turning into an absolute unity. That's just what love is. And when you experience that, that's what your human emotions signal to you as feelings of love. Human love is just a little tip of the iceberg of metaphysical love, God's love. So, in conclusion, a solipsism without infinite love is false. A solipsism with total connection to everything and you drowning in infinite love, that's the true solipsism. So this is how you know. If you're asking, well, Leo, I've had some solipsistic ideas and I felt bad about it. How do I know if that's true or false? If you felt bad about it, it's false. Now, don't get me wrong. The insights you might have been true, but you're interpreting them, and then your ego is taking that into a negative, false direction. So, you have to kind of separate out the truth. Like, for example, you might realize your mother is imaginary. That's true. That's not false. But then what you do with that and how you get butthurt about that and how you take that as unreal and negative and all the meaning you attach to it, that's the false part. And then if there's no love present with your realization, that also means that it's a shallow level of realization and you have a lot deeper, higher to go. So every Godhead that I connected to is identical to myself. I'm not connecting to something different out there somewhere. I'm just realizing, literally what the connection is just realizing that, oh, that Godhead is me. Oh, okay. Yeah, we connected because it's just me. I'm connecting to myself. It's an identity. The connection goes so deep, it becomes an identity. So I know a lot of you have struggled with solipsism and asked a lot of questions about solipsism. This question of and topic of solipsism requires a lot of gradual, repeated exposure, integration work. You have to awaken to it, and then you have to integrate, integrate, kind of like keep integrating, because basically what you're doing is you're deconstructing your mind, you're deconstructing various kinds of illusions, and as that's happening, you're losing sense of meaning, you're losing a sense of purpose, right? Because your whole life was built on this house of cards. Probably even your motivation to get out of bed in the morning was based upon a lie. So when you realize it was a lie, then maybe you don't want to get out of bed in the morning, you're feeling depressed. But these are just the early stages you have to understand, right? Like there has to be a lot of integration work, years of integration work. You have to confront the illusions that your mind creates again and again and again and again. And in that process, the ego mind will hate it. It'll misinterpret it. It'll bitch and moan about it. It'll get nihilistic about it, depressed about it, and so forth. And so you have to be careful about that, because if you're taking on the solipsism stuff, and the things that I'm saying, if you're just taking this on as concepts and theories and philosophy, you're only going to suffer more from this. You need actual awakenings. If you've not had an actual awakening to the fact that you are absolute consciousness, that you are completely sovereign and one, then you're just stuck in mental masturbation and it's going to hurt you. Now, if you have had some of those awakenings, that's good, but you're still not out of the woods. You're still probably in a bad spot. You're going to have a lot more of those, fully integrate those over years, the way that I've been doing, and then maybe you can break through to some of those more positive, more like togetherness aspects of what's being talked about here. When you're thinking about solipsism, also just think about the difference between solipsism and its opposite, and realize that even that difference is itself imaginary. Therefore, any suffering arising out of you realizing solipsism is also imaginary, and it's not the ultimate truth. So this is tricky stuff. I'm pointing out various traps for you here. So the key lesson, another key lesson here is this. If you claim solipsism, but you aren't falling in love with yourself and with reality, then you're going wrong. You've taken a wrong turn somewhere, or you haven't completed your work yet. You're stuck in a sort of a local minimum on this journey. You're stuck in a dip. If you're feeling depressed, nihilistic, suicidal, if you're feeling lonely, cynical, hopeless, if you're hating yourself, hating others, hating God, hating life, hating reality, if you're afraid, if you're anxious, if you're asking questions like, well, why did God create this hellhole that I'm in? You're definitely not awake. Awakening wipes all of that out, at least temporarily. It shouldn't be contributing to those things. If what you think and call awakening is contributing to all those things that I just mentioned, then something is going horribly wrong, and you need to rethink what you're doing, what you're calling awakening. You got to rethink that, because maybe what you're calling awakening isn't anything that I'm talking about. So in the end, the way you know whether you're doing this awakening process correctly is that you should be moving towards more love, more connection, more peace, more joy, more amazement and wonderment at just like how amazing the structure of reality is, you shouldn't be cursing nature. You should be marveling at nature. You should be marveling at yourself, how amazing the structure of all this is, how ingenious it is, how brilliant it is, how intelligent it is, not how awful it is. It's not a dark thing. So be very careful about your ideas of solipsism. They're not what I'm talking about. The way you know that your awakening is genuine and full is if you experience profound levels of love, awe, and wonder, and you're feeling whole, healthy, and connected. And you're not hating other human beings. You're not becoming misanthropic. You don't want to hurt them. You fully understand them. You have compassion for them. You understand their limitations, and you understand why they act awful. You have understanding for all of that, and you're capable of forgiving that. That's how you know that this is genuine and proper awakening. And if you're getting more bitter, then you're going down some wrong path, so be careful. Trust your feelings a bit on this. Your feelings, your heart is guiding you towards love, not towards bitterness. If you're experiencing a lot of bitterness, sit down, go back to the drawing board, say, wait a minute, where did I go wrong? Okay, I'm feeling bitter, I'm feeling negative, I'm feeling depressed, I've been doing a bunch of meditating and I've been doing a lot of psychedelics and all this stuff, and now I'm feeling worse. I'm feeling depressed and nihilistic, and I can't even motivate myself to get out of bed. What's happening to me? Where did I go wrong? That's how I want your thought process to work. And then sit down and kind of like go and say, well, where did I make a mistake? Where did I misinterpret some teaching? Where did, maybe Leo said this, but maybe he meant something else and I didn't quite understand that. Or maybe I'm interpreting this whole set of teachings in some twisted way. Maybe I'm resisting here, or I'm avoiding this thing here, or I still have some fear I haven't confronted there, and that is tripping up and twisting up this whole process, which should be a beautiful process of love, awe, and wonder, and wholeness, and connection, rather than misery. So what do you do if you're stuck in a negative solipsistic spiral? Well, you could just take a break from this whole work and just go back to ordinary life, distract yourself, go, watch some movies, have some sex, enjoy life. You could do that and then kind of forget about it. Sometimes that's necessary if you're really in a bad place. Or if you're feeling more powerful, then you could actually start to question it and deconstruct it. And you could work, you could double down your spiritual efforts. You could go back, kind of rethink your spiritual techniques and methods, and maybe make some adjustments, and then go for a more full, more holistic awakening. And remember that awakening is not guesswork. It's not speculation. It's not theory. It's not philosophy. Philosophy is not awakening. If you're having doubts about whether you're awake or not, you're not awake. If you've had a little bit of awakening and then you're still having doubts about it, and you're thinking, well, yeah, maybe I had some awakenings, but Leo, how do I know if it's true? How do I know if that love that I experienced was really real? How do I know that my experience of God was the real God, or maybe I was just fooling myself and maybe I was just delusional and hallucinating on some chemicals? If you're having these kinds of doubts, then you didn't really awaken, or your awakening was so short and so shallow that you need a lot more of it. Real awakening has no doubts. There's no doubt, there's no room for doubt in awakening. Awakening is absolute consciousness, absolute truth. You're absolutely conscious. There's nothing to doubt there. If you're doubting it, you're not absolutely conscious. Don't worry, you're not going to miss it. You're not just going to have an awakening that's like, what? Was that an awakening or not? I don't know. Maybe I missed it. Maybe I was distracted. I was daydreaming and I missed my awakening. No. The awakening is so radical, it'll stop everything. The real awakening is so shocking, you're not going to miss it. So don't worry. You just have deeper to go. That's all. All right, that's it. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it. one last point I want to make here is that for those of you who are taking the psychedelic path towards awakening, which I do recommend, it can be very effective. A couple of points about that. How do you keep yourself from deluding yourself with psychedelics? That is possible. That is possible. But remember also, you could delude yourself without psychedelics too. So that's also possible. In fact, even more possible. The majority of humans on this planet are deluded without ever having taken a single psychedelic. And in fact, the majority of humans on this planet are deluded about the function and nature of psychedelics. So when people tell me that, oh, Leo, but psychedelics are dangerous because you could delude yourself. But that's already the case. So what's the danger? Now, there's other dangers. And by the way, I've enumerated all the many dangers about psychedelics. Some of them are pretty serious. You want to go check that out before you actually use psychedelics. I have an episode called something like the top dangers of using psychedelics. Go search for that. I list a couple dozen different dangers that you should be aware of. And yes, deluding yourself is a danger. Deluding yourself is always a danger, with or without psychedelics or whatever you do, whatever spiritual path you take, it's always a danger. So, but anyways, how do you confront this specific danger? Well, trip more, trip deeper, integrate, spend a lot of time integrating, really contemplate your trips, journal about them, think about them very carefully. And also seek to invalidate your past awakenings and trips. So you might have one awakening where you experience God. You might have another awakening where you experience love. Another awakening where you experience absolute sovereignty. Another awakening where you connect with some other being or whatever. Okay, now do 5 more awakenings on top of those and try to, 5 more trips on top of those, and try to invalidate all your previous ones. And see if it works for you. See what comes up. Don't get attached to any particular idea, even like the idea that you're God. Don't get attached to that. Ideally, every time you trip, you throw all your ideas away. You're willing to invalidate any one of them. You're willing to experience something totally new that contradicts everything you thought or said before. You have to have this kind of beginner's mind attitude with every trip. Because if you get too attached to certain ideas, that will start to color your trips, and then your trips will go down certain directions and not potentially others. And then the more you try to invalidate your own spiritual insights and understandings, you'll see which of those can be invalidated, and then other ones you'll try to invalidate. It just, you can't invalidate it. And then this builds real, solid understanding and then very deep integration of these things. And you might say, well, Leo, but what if I've tried to invalidate it 5 times and I still haven't, but that doesn't mean it's absolutely true. Look, you can only do as good as you can do. The way that science works, and really tripping on psychedelics is no different than science. You're doing science. You're doing inner science, science of consciousness. The way science works is that you can never absolutely invalidate something. All you can do is you can try to invalidate it as many times as you have time and energy to do, to the point where you're reasonably confident in it, and that's just as good as you can do. That's as good as a human can do, right? It's always the case that you can always make the argument how do you know that the speed of light is whatever it is? Or how do you know that gravity works the way, Einstein says? How do you know general relativity is true? Well, because we've tried to invalidate it thousands of times and haven't succeeded yet. Okay, well, that doesn't mean it can't be invalidated tomorrow. It could be. How do you know the sun will rise tomorrow? Only because it's risen every day of your life, but that doesn't mean that it won't rise tomorrow. This is just the nature of experimental empirical method. Remember that the truth is not fragile. It will stand up to vigorous testing and prodding. It will stand up to skepticism. It will stand up to efforts to invalidate it. So if you're afraid to test some theory of yours or some idea you have or some spiritual insight you have, if you're afraid to really push on it, that's probably because it isn't true. If it was really true, you wouldn't be afraid to push on it because the truth will support your weight, full weight on it. That's what's so awesome about the truth, is that you can't invalidate it. And the more you try to invalidate it, the more obvious it becomes. And also, to avoid deluding yourself with psychedelics, pay extra attention to any kind of subtle fear in you when it comes to tripping and exploring different parts of consciousness in your trip. Those parts you're afraid to explore. You're like, oh, well, I don't want to contemplate that topic, or I don't want to contemplate this topic because it's scary or it's uncomfortable, whatever. That's where the truth is hiding. The truth, when you fully are in possession of the truth with awakened consciousness, there's not going to be any fear at all. Consciousness eclipses all possibility of fear. So fear is your clue. And that fear gets replaced with love. If you're doing this process correctly. All right, that does it. I felt like usually I don't share my latest awakenings, but I felt like sharing this one because it was so unique and I haven't heard anybody else describing this. So that's that. Again, I'm not sitting here claiming to be the best, the most, and I'm not claiming to have all my awakening complete. I'm always open to more. I'm excited to explore new stuff, discover even higher awakenings. That's always the case with all of my work. It's always been that way. This is an evolving process, right? And you have to get good in this work to be willing to just like go beyond all of your past experiences and all of your past understandings, keep pushing beyond, and just keep going. Don't worry about when is it going to end? When am I going to be done? Don't worry about it. Just keep going. Why do you need it to be done? What if there's a never-ending ladder of insight and awakenings that you can have? Why not climb that ladder and see where it takes you? I see people way too eager to claim themselves done and to claim that they've understood everything. I think you should understand how foolish that is to assume such things. How do you know when you're done? Who would tell you? So my attitude is just keep going, keep exploring, keep prodding at your own ideas. And I think you'll be rewarded with higher and higher truths and discoveries, deeper and richer and greater degrees of love. And that's, to me, what this whole journey is about.